So there's an expression called a bridge too far, and it means taking drastic action. It means going beyond the point of no return. And back last year, we saw for the first time America sanctioning a country as big as Russia, and it shocked the world and started the entire de-dollarization movement. Sure, Russia got locked out of SWIFT and they can't access their frozen reserves. Saying that didn't hurt would be a lie. The effects are undeniable. It did inflict pain. In total, the West has frozen around $160 billion worth of Russian assets. Of that amount, 100 billion belongs to the Russian central bank. Apparently, there are still $200 billion of assets they can't track down. But 100 billion is still a lot of money, and the final destination of that cash could very well be Ukraine. And over the past few days, Congress has been arguing back and forth, and it all has to do with giving Ukraine money. Since the start of the conflict, America has provided $113 billion in assistance to Zelensky, and Biden is asking for another $24 billion. And this kind of tells us that parts of Congress are tired of pumping money to the war effort. But this also opens up a dangerous possibility that America and her allies might utilize the frozen Russian assets. Because if you think about it, at least from their perspective, the money is just sitting there, and chances are it probably won't go back to the Russians. Even if Biden dangles it in front of Putin as a concession or a bait, I don't think he will bite. In a shocking report from the FT, the US Special Envoy just told the world that Russia's frozen reserves ought to be used to rebuild Ukraine. Now, this isn't some random official like Sullivan or Blinken. This is President Biden's special envoy for the rebuilding of Ukraine. Curiously, this is also one of Kiev's central demands as well. However, I believe this is a bridge too far. Immobilizing Russia's assets is one thing, but confiscating them for any purpose is something that is unprecedented. If you do that, you will literally risk opening Pandora's box, and this will obviously lead to de-dollarization like never before. But guess what? I think they no longer care. Here's what she said. Given the destruction the Russians have caused, they ought to be contributing to the recovery of Ukraine. So this could seriously become a reality. So Russia might very well kiss goodbye to their reserves. But how is this going to happen? What are the mechanics? The financial aspect of this is really fascinating because the West is trying to find loopholes to use their assets. They can't outright confiscate it because the optics will look really bad. And let's talk about precedent first. Back in 1992, after the first Gulf War, Iraqi assets were allocated to Kuwait and were approved by the United Nations Security Council. But there is a difference now. Russia's reserves were amassed by selling energy to the West. Their billions were made selling oil and gas to the world. So the same situation doesn't really apply. And here's where things get really interesting. The West is thinking of investing the money and then using the interest payments, the proceeds, to fund Ukraine. And this means possibly taking Russia's reserves and investing them into Euro bonds or maybe even US treasuries. And the key here is to generate interest on the bonds and use the income derived. And if you look at the yields of treasuries today, you quickly see how much income the frozen Russian reserves can actually generate. And let's have a simple hypothetical scenario using just treasury bonds. If the West somehow takes all $100 billion and dumps it into 10-year bonds, yielding 4.6%, the interest payment will be $4.6 billion every single year. And in 10 years, that amount will be at least $46 billion. That is a ton of money that can go to Ukraine, and technically, the principal is untouched. The nominal amount is still there, but here's the secondary effect that makes me believe this might actually happen. What happens when you buy bonds? You increase the value of bonds, basic demand and supply. At the same time, this keeps bond yields down, and this is especially useful at a time where the Federal Reserve is hiking rates to fight inflation. Now, will this happen? I have no idea, but the incentives are obviously there for both Ukraine and the bond market where the money flows into. However, will this money be enough? $4.6 billion sounds like a tidy sum of money, but it is actually a drop in the ocean. According to the World Bank, it will cost at least $411 billion over the next 10 years to rebuild Ukraine. And if the West invests the Russian reserves over the next 10 years, there will still be a shortfall of at least $360 billion. Where is that money going to come from? Even if they use the entire frozen reserves tomorrow, there's still a $300 billion gap. The money will have to be borrowed into existence again. Either the Federal Reserve or the ECB has to print money to get the cash, or the Treasury has to issue more bonds to raise the money. But that will keep yields higher for much longer. And back in March, the Eurozone looked into the various options of how they can use the frozen reserves, the frozen assets in the bloc. And their research led them towards a financial conclusion. They will take the frozen reserves and invest them into short term bonds and bills from a range of EU countries. And from that result, the EU Commission expects to generate a return of 2.6%. Now, that isn't a lot of return. Honestly, if I were them, I would just roll it into US treasuries. At least they will get a higher yield. But this move is probably a mixture of punishing Putin and financial desperation rather than practicality. The sanctions aren't really working, and Russia is still fighting on the field. There have been near zero outcomes after 18 months of battle. However, if they do this, it would forever damage the reputation of the West as custodians of money and financial reserves. Countries all over the world store their money and gold in the vaults of New York and London. And if this were to happen, a ton of nations will get spooked out and likely start pulling everything away, sending them back home. So this is going to backfire badly. And if you think the financial sanctions were bad, this will kick things into overdrive. Countries like China and Saudi Arabia, which have been selling treasuries, will start to dump even more dollar denominated assets. And this will be the final straw that breaks the camel's back. There's literally no U turn from this action. Once you do this, you unleash the de-dollarization demon forever. Back in May, America already approved the first transfer of Russian funds to Ukraine. However, it was from an oligarch and it involved only millions of dollars. Now, that is bad enough, but if they move up the food chain towards the sovereign assets of Russia, that will be crossing the Rubicon. And the most obvious blowback will be giving China and Russia the ultimate excuse once again to de-dollarize the world. There are going to be more videos like this and articles on Bloomberg about the end of the dollar if the US or the West goes through with this. And here's another thing I find counterproductive. They are losing a bargaining chip with Russia, and this conflict will likely end on the negotiating table. If you use the Russian reserves now, they use the assets now. You have already shown your hand. You are playing checkers when you should be playing chess. And according to the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, Russia's rising trade in the yuan in the wake of the war in Ukraine and the Western sanctions may end up undermining the US dollar. And this is a huge agenda that underpins all of China's and Russia's moves over the past 12 months. There's a reason why China is pushing so hard on the Belt Road Initiative, the BRI, and it's all about conducting bilateral trade outside of the dollar. Russia has also announced time and time again that they are accepting the Chinese yuan in addition to the ruble for their oil and gas sales. In fact, the yuan is now used to settle 75% of Russia's trade with China and 25% of their trade with other countries. And this is a direct consequence of the previous financial sanctions. That was a wake up call. And if the West continues to weaponize the dollar, oh boy, I have no idea what will really happen next. But I do know what will be the biggest beneficiary of this action. It's not going to be a country or a person. The biggest winner from confiscating Russian assets is going to be gold. And there's a big reason why central banks all buy gold. It's not only just to store value, there's now an urgent need to secure your wealth in an asset that has no counterparty risk. Russia's central bank chief has underscored this sentiment, saying how they have woken up. They are rebuilding their reserves in assets that the West can't freeze. And that's why China has also been publicly buying gold for 10 months in a row. It's a big show and tell, it's an advertisement. They're essentially reminding the world month after month to de-dollarize, and it kind of seems to be working. Since the start of the conflict last year, central banks have been net buyers month after month except for April and May 2023. And if the West really moves to confiscate Russian reserves, this will light the fire across all central banks in the world to buy even more gold. There's going to be a key difference this time. It won't be gold stored in the West. It won't be in some vault in the Fed or the Bank of England. Countries are learning the true meaning of counterparty risk. Back in June, Venezuela lost their long-running battle to get back their gold reserves. They had almost $2 billion worth held in the BOE's underground vault, which is still inaccessible. And this is terrifying and undermines trust further in the West as custodians of wealth. And if the unthinkable happens, We are going to see the greatest exodus of physical gold move from the west back to the east, and the biggest winner will be gold itself, and the biggest loser will be the US dollar system. Confiscating Russia's assets will be the last straw. They might win the battle, but they would lose the economic war. This is simply a bridge too far. But let me know what you think in the comments below. Will the West really confiscate Russia's reserves? Or will they back down and look at the bigger picture? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe, be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.